I'm Professor Patrick Parkison via video conference. I now welcome you, Professor, from the University of Queensland. Good morning for being here. I don't think I need to ask the Professor to refrain from using unparliamentary language or swearing or offensive terms, even though you might wish to at times. If you're quoting someone, it's pretty important that you don't do it. People fall in the trap of doing it when they're quoting someone else. If you could refrain from doing that, that would help our process here at this end. About the naming of persons who may not wish to be identified, can you be super careful identifying individuals? Could you err on the side of caution and not mention them, please, if that's at all possible? I now invite you to make an opening statement. We say about 5 minutes, but obviously the longer your opening statement goes, the shorter time you get for questions. So it's up to you which way you want to manage that. And when you first speak, if you could just announce your name and title for the purposes of Hansard, please. Thank you, Professor.
Well, thank you, Chair. And so for Hansard, I'm Professor Patrick Parkison, Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. My thanks to the committee for allowing me to address on this very important bill. Let me begin by saying that I have no problem with having some reforms in this area to allow people who identify as trans or gender diverse to register their gender identity without the need for complex and risky surgeries. I've made proposals at the end of my submission for exactly how to do that without adversely affecting other people. However, the Queensland government has quite mysteriously, to my mind, chosen the most radical expression of a self-ID law that is possible. Seemingly it has ignored all the problems that are inherent in the approach it has taken. I want to focus on two objections to this bill. The first is that it provides recognition of gender identity by altering birth certificates. Birth certificates are matters of historical record. Apart from babies born with intersex conditions, which is very rare that their sex is ambiguous, babies are born either being boys or girls. Later in life, perhaps during troubled teenage years when they are exploring their identity, they may adopt a gender identity which is incongruent with their natal sex. This is very common for teenage girls these days who decide they are trans, gender fluid, non-binary, or just queer. But they don't cease to have a sex. They don't cease to be girls. They still menstruate. They can still fall pregnant if they have unprotected sex. They're still prone to specifically female health problems, such as endometriosis. They have both a sex and a gender identity with which their sex is incongruent. This bill allows their gender identity to displace their sex as a matter of law, and that, with respect, is madness. The second major problem with this bill is that it changes a person's sex for all legal purposes in Queensland law. If this bill is passed, the registered non-binary teenager will be in law neither female nor male. What does that even mean from a legal perspective? I can't tell you. And I can assure you that the department, just ask the registrar, is going to have particularly adverse consequences for women and girls. While some people who choose to register a change of sex under this legislation will be people who have long lived as being of a different sex to their birth, it seems inevitable from the experience of other countries that many mentally unwell men will also seek recognition of a trans identity through this legislation, rather than as a matter of careful medical diagnosis. Most mentally ill men, of course, represent no threat at all to women's safety. But encountering them in what is meant to be a female-only space, including a space where women may undress, could be deeply upsetting for many women and girls, and think particularly of the minority cultures within our society, for whom this will be a dreadful concern. They might probably describe these men as creepy. Unfortunately, there's the possibility that some mentally unwell men may be more dangerous than this. Now, even if there are not many who change their sex and their birth certificates by registration, the wider harm from self-ID laws is that it becomes very difficult to object to any man in a woman's changing room or toilet facility, since they might have a legal right to be regarded as female. Women's rights to bodily privacy will be seriously eroded You cannot get that back. Once you agree as a parliament that your sex can be changed by nothing more than registration, this is a big issue for women and girls. There's no way of getting around that. Now, the bill takes the most extreme approach possible to this problem by wiping out the exemptions for single-sex spaces that currently exist in the Anti-Discrimination Act 1991. There are no proposals on the table to extend those exemptions to sex characteristics, which will become unlawful grounds for discrimination under this. Women's gyms will be able to be sued for unlawful discrimination on the basis of sex characteristics. Their current exemptions will exclude a female by registration who's anatomically male. The same applies to women's refuges. The law will not permit females by registration to be excluded from women's wards in hospitals, female changing rooms, in public swimming pools, and all other single-sex facilities. There will also be the same impacts on women's sports. It will be unlawful under this bill to discriminate against any legally registered female based upon their sex characteristics. That is, that they are anatomically male. Now, it may be that the government has simply not thought through all the consequences for anti-discrimination law and other legislation by making these changes to birth certificate law. The department has said as much. In response to my submission and many others, including the Law Society and the Queensland Human Rights Commission, it says in effect, yeah, we haven't thought through any of this. We'll do it later. Pass this bill now, not knowing all the consequences, and then we will think about the consequences and come back to you. Well, with the greatest of respect to the Department of Justice and the Attorney General, that is not how mature governments make laws. You think through all the consequences before you bring a bill into Parliament, not after. And you think through what are the conflicts between trans rights and women's rights. Which rights of women are you going to abolish? And which are you going to protect by exemptions? Parliament needs to know. And the public needs to know as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Laura?
Thank you, Professor, and thank you so much for your written submission and for getting that in under the short period of time that you had to complete it. It's very comprehensive and it is very helpful. I just wanted you to talk through the committee. You mentioned that your written submission covers off some of the ways that Part 5, the objectives of Part 5 might be achieved without running into some of the issues that you've already discussed just then and that are in your written submission. Can you summarise that for us, please? In your view, yes, some of those objectives in allowing the LGBTIQ community to have gender identity within legislation?
Yes, certainly. So, first of all, you pass a law about a gender recognition certificate. You don't change birth certificates. You leave birth certificates where they are. People have a sex and a gender identity. You register the gender identity. Secondly, you have some sort of screening process in terms of mental health and criminal history. Thirdly, you are very clear about what this applies to. It can apply to photographic identification on driving licenses. It can apply to other aspects of Queensland government law, but you work through very carefully what it can't apply to. And that's where you have to work through the issues with women's interests, the multicultural society in which we live, and the adverse consequences. Now, what that does mean is that you have a more modest law, which allows some flexibility, because nobody will be sued for discrimination, but many men who've transitioned will pass as women, will go into women's facilities, and nobody will worry about that. But we haven't completely upended the law to provide better support for this very small number of people.
Thank you.
Sandy?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Professor Parkinson. And yes, your submission was very extensive. Just to further on, can you elaborate on your concern in relation to the effect of descriptors such as genderqueer or non-binary? And that was on page 10 of your submission.
Yes, thank you. Science knows male and female. It does know intersex. About 1 in 50,000 babies are born with ambiguous characteristics, which eventually gets sorted in some way into being either male or female in terms of reproductive capacity. But science knows nothing as scientific fact about being genderqueer or non-binary. These are social identities, psychological, one may say, but they are not medical ones. And so to say that you can change your sex on the basis of being genderqueer, as opposed to saying, I have an identity which is genderqueer, those are two completely different things.
Right, thank you.
John?
Thank you, Professor, for your submission. And I just wanted to ask a question about some of the legal ramifications you raised about the ability for registered sexes on birth certificates being changed. Do you hold concerns that, or do you have any concerns that the system, if it's established the way the bill is set out at the moment, could be subject to abuse by some members of the community?
Yes, I mean, a lot of this debate has been about whether trans people could be sex offenders, and my answer is no, not any more than anybody else in the community. That isn't the issue. The issue is that once you accept self-ID, you allow anybody to say that they are a sex other than what they are. And we have a significant problem with mental illness in this area. If you look at the research on the numbers of teenage girls going to gender clinics, so many of them are on the autism spectrum, so many have serious mental health issues. And this can be so with males as well. And so the risk is that when you just open the doors wide and say anybody can identify as another sex, then you open the door wide to those who are mentally ill, who may be sex predators, or, as is happening a lot in England and elsewhere these days, just simply say, I'm male, but I'm a lesbian, therefore you should have sex with me as a lesbian, which seems to be one of the manifestations of this mental illness.
Thank you. John T?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and good morning, Professor. Professor, I've just got a couple of questions, but just before I do that, can I just clarify your submission and your appearance this morning infers you're representing on behalf of UQ? I was of the view you were no longer with UQ. Is that correct, or are you still?
No, I thank you for the question. I continue as an emeritus professor at the University of Queensland, but always when any academic appears, they are appearing in a personal capacity and not representing the university to which they belong.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. I think it might be helpful, Professor, because obviously you've probably read some of the submissions that we've received, and I think it would be fair to say there's a lot of opinion in what we've received, which is absolutely the process. But as a professor, I wonder if you could unpack for the committee, that spectrum of credibility. When we're looking at evidence and information, there's a spectrum of credibility, and maybe you could take a moment to explain that. Obviously, at one end, you've got opinion and media reporting, and at the other, there's peer-reviewed articles.
Yeah, so on the issue of transgender identification, there's a huge amount of medicine and science, medical and scientific literature on these issues. The bill is premised on the idea that we are born in the wrong body, or people could be born in the wrong body. There's actually not much evidence for that. It appears overwhelmingly that those who are now identifying as trans or gender diverse or queer, that there are psychological factors. The peer-reviewed research is showing us that family dysfunction, childhood adverse experiences like sexual abuse, disordered attachments, these other mental health issues are predominantly driving the numbers of young people in particular who are seeking to alter their bodies through medical clinics. So there's now a worldwide debate, a very serious worldwide debate about these issues and whether we should medicalize these young people at all. On the other hand, you've got a data-free body of advocacy which says that we should respect transhuman rights, which of course we should, but which doesn't engage with that scientific literature at all, and relies largely, I think, on emotion and claims and appeals to human rights for quite radical changes to the law of our society. I hope that's a sufficient answer for now.
Yes, certainly it's a good start. You would accept there is overwhelming evidence that would be in conflict with most of your submission, though?
No, absolutely not. I have spent a long time examining the overwhelming evidence for the positions that I have put forward to you.
On page 11, you said that the evidence is clear that while transgender is not a mental illness and is no longer classified as a disorder in the DSM, some mentally very unwell males are likely to seek to be recognised as female in law and may have expanded opportunities to threaten the safety and well-being of women and girls. I won't speak to the inferences that are made at the end of that statement, but can you point me to the evidence? It essentially implies that there's evidence linking predatory behaviours and a desire to access female-only spaces. I'm interested in the evidence to support that statement.
Well, thank you. I made it very clear in my submission I was not suggesting that those who are long identified as trans are in any way mentally ill, nor are they at higher likelihood of being sexual predators. None of that is true. But once you take away any checks, any medical diagnosis, any scrutiny, then you open the floodgates to anybody. And then that's when anybody who may be quite seriously mentally ill or have other predatory intentions could manipulate the new openness. Now, the evidence of this is all over the world. We have seen the numbers of sexual assaults in women's prisons. We have seen a variety of adverse consequences. It's a very good website by Holly Lawford Smith in Melbourne called No Conflict, they said. And you can read through the many anecdotes of the adverse consequences which come from a law like this. But that's what I am relying on. Open the floodgates, remove the barriers, and you have no way of controlling who will adopt a change of sex.
This will be the last question.
Thanks, Peter. Just finally on that, your statement implies that there is no scrutiny in place by agencies that run female-only services. Have you engaged with those particular services and spoken to them about their onboarding and intake procedures, or is that where is that opinion coming from?
Well, the issue is not female-only services under the existing law. The issue is that a women's refuge will not lawfully be allowed to discriminate against a female by registration who seeks access to that facility. They'll be
I'm asking, the question is, have you engaged with those services to get their views before writing your submission? Sorry?
No, I did try to engage with Women's Legal Services. They haven't reapplied.
Thank you.
Thank you. That brings to an end this part of the program. Thank you for your evidence today, Professor, and thank you for your written submission.